Wait for the little wait for the little voice. There it is. So welcome everybody if you're listening to the recording. Welcome to everybody that's on here live tonight. And I'm Lee Newitt, one of the co-founders of the Centre. That's it, the Centre for Spirituality, Ecology and Mental Health. And I'm going to pass to my colleague Romy Brooks, who is the other co-founder for the Centre. Over to you then, Romy.
Hello, welcome, and thank you, Lee. This is the third year of the Eunoia Summit, brought to you by the Centre for Spirituality, Ecology and Mental Health. A little bit about the word Eunoia. It's an ancient Greek word meaning something more than goodwill and beautiful thinking. The word captures a sense of honourable reputation, empathy and readiness to help. It emphasises that right speech and right thinking leads to right actions for the good of the community. We are a modest collective of researchers, teachers and practitioners working together to provide heart-led and centred resources, low cost and evidence-based, to support the spiritual development and spiritual well-being of the community. In times of turmoil, uncertainty and fear, the most important thing we can do is to come together to build caring and compassionate communities where we can grow together and become wise and more fully step into our courageous, authentic selves. In doing so, we hope to become better supports to each other and to the planet. These are not new ideas, they are ancestral threads belonging to the ancient wisdoms, traditions that are finding more and more support in the scientific research of today. So that's a little bit about ourselves. And I'd like to say thank you very much to Philip, who will be doing the Q&A today, just asking if people want to put some questions in the chat. That would be lovely, and then we'll have a few questions to ask at the end. Also, you've already seen Lee and me, so that's it. And now I would really like to welcome Dr. Madeleine Castro, Senior Lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, where she teaches various modules at undergraduate and master's levels, covering social, interdisciplinary, critical, psychosocial development, as well as transpersonal, psychoanalysis, and parapsychology. Her master's from Goldsmith led to a scholarship funding for her PhD at the University of York, continuing on her research into exceptional human experiences, how people talk about them and make sense of them. He co-directs a network of researchers, academics, and postgraduates interested in exploring the extraordinary. Her interests include the exploration of possible relationships between exceptional human experiences and spirituality, exceptional human experiences, paranormal, and popular culture. More recent work, which we are going to be hearing about tonight, is exploring women's circles and the red tent movement. And this is a part of a much larger project about the red tent in the UK society. So please feel free to put in any questions. I'm really looking forward to tonight's talk. So thank you very much, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Romy, and thank you very much for the invitation, Lee, to come and talk to you all tonight. I'm going to share my screen with the presentation that I've got prepared for this evening. Hopefully that will work. Yes, okay. So what I'm talking about tonight is connected to the research that I've been doing specifically on red tents and women's circles, and I'm putting myself out there in many senses because I'm reflecting on my own experiences of participation in a nature women's circle that I've been in for almost 7 years now. And in this paper, what I want to do is kind of contextualize, offer some personal experiences of this closed women's circle that I've been part of, which takes place in a natural woodland setting, hence the woods, and also offer a few details about my participation and observations. But before I do that, I want to kind of give a little academic context, some of which is kind of the sort of stuff that I usually talk about, and some of it is a little bit different, but hopefully of interest to you. So I want to talk firstly about considering a little bit of the scientific literature around nature settings and the reputed effects on human well-being. And then also to consider research in transpersonal psychology and ecofeminism in particular to help us think through that kind of relationship with nature and what it might mean for us as humans, all of which sounds maybe familiar in some capacity. Then I want to explore some of my own research, but not only mine, there's some other research into women's circles as well, and red tents, which are kind of related and housed in the same area, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Following this, I will give the portrait of a nature women's circle, which is really some of my own reflections, including rather, well, bravely and maybe terrifyingly, some of my own poetry about my own experiences in that environment. And then I want to kind of locate some of my experiences in some of the literature and think about the kind of positive, life-affirming aspects that have kind of happened before then thinking a little bit more critically about some of the challenges associated with the practice of women's circles and what I call the kind of holistic realm, which is often kind of abutting with things like neoliberalism and capitalism and politics and what we mean by the social good and some of those. So depending on how much I've waffled, I'll see what I've got time to kind of cover and talk about. So the first thing I want to talk about is nature's benefits. Research mostly quite helpfully tells us maybe what we already intuitively know is that nature's good for us. It often feels good. We know from experience being immersed in a natural setting. There's a subjective kind of positive, calming, regulating, soothing, restorative effect. And much of the research, unsurprisingly, kind of bears this out. So it is those predominantly quite calming settings that have been of interest to medics, psychologists, therapeutic practitioners when looking for ways to maybe improve or facilitate mental health or better mental health, better well-being. And those nature settings potentially offer us a way in which to physically improve or heal or feed ourselves or nurture ourselves in some ways. So the kinds of things that have been discovered, research has demonstrated spending time in nature, providing the people feel secure in those environments, effectively counteracts stress. So that might be decreasing blood pressure or reducing stress-related hormones, but also calming nervous system activity. Additionally, this might include strengthening the immune function, boosting self-confidence, alleviating anxiety, improving cognitive function, enhancing overall emotional well-being, reducing aggressive behavior, accelerating recovery from illness. The list goes on and on and on. Broadly speaking, you could say the sense of thriving or flourishing that we feel as human beings in certain aspects of our lives is really, really improved by being in nature. Indeed, there are emerging findings that note that immersion in nature appears to bring a positive increase in attitudes and behaviours towards helping and supporting the natural environment. I'll return to that later. So what does this mean? Scientific research consistently demonstrates time in nature increases health and well-being in a variety of ways, including physical health, mental health, social connection. So indeed, findings have shown that generally exposure to nature, which is defined and measured in different ways across studies and disciplines, demonstrates positive associations with overall physical and psychological health, emotional well-being, mortality, and a host of other health outcomes. Now, what's interesting about this potentially is a lot of the research is often quite quantitative, therefore it is quite reductive, and it tends to be focused on those ideas around, well, what are the optimal conditions and the minimal levels of exposure to nature we might need in those environments. This kind of, certainly in Western contexts, And also then what should that immersion look like, particularly if we're talking about urban environments? And in which case, nature exposure becomes this kind of dosage or prescription. It's a treatment, therefore, for issues such as stress or anxiety or depression. Now, that in and of itself might not be a huge problem, although it is quite a biomedical way of looking at nature as this kind of, you need your 1.2 minutes a day or whatever it is, 12 minutes a day in order to be mentally and physically healthy. But also it raises a couple of issues. Firstly, around different definitions of nature. So what constitutes nature exposure in lots of these studies ranges from kind of passive viewing of nature through a window to maybe being in a forest, for instance, which complicates how to compare things. And then also artificial versus maybe natural settings. So parks and gardens and cultivated nature spaces versus more wild or undisturbed kind of environments. Again, blurring boundaries of what qualifies therapeutic nature immersion. But these are potentially side issues, especially if we're thinking of looking at the more in-depth experiences of people in nature. What does it mean to, as Backley and et al. Suggest, to explore the kind of phenomenological experiences of people who have spent time in nature? Phenomenology tries to understand ours and others' sense of being in the world and what we experience through our kind of existence. And this might look to comprehend what our experience of nature is and how it's experienced as well-being in a meaningful kind of way. In this way, then, human encounters become a kind of active relational process, one of, as Abram suggested, embodied dialogue between humans and nature. Indeed, in transpersonal psychology, Swan suggests that relating to nature in those kind of meaningful and thoughtful ways, ultimately a kind of form of emotional bonding with nature, can help cultivate an ecological conscience. That's the second time I've mentioned that, and that it's borne out in research. Interestingly, in ways that learning about facts about the environment and finding out information about how we're mistreating our planet doesn't do. Swan details things like various exceptional nature bonding experiences that often contain transpersonal elements and might happen in these kinds of special or sort of seemingly sacred nature spaces. And indeed, other research, including my own PhD, records how sublime, sometimes life-changing, transcendent experiences appear to be triggered by natural environments. Will Adams builds on this in his book, A Wild and Sacred Call, Nature, Psyche, Spirit, which is a contemplative and interdisciplinary exploration of the deep reciprocal relationship between human consciousness, the psyche, spirituality, and the natural world. Drawing on Jungian psychology, phenomenology, eco-psychology, and indigenous wisdom, he argues that modernity's alienation from nature has led to ecological and psychological crises, and that a rekindling this sacred connection with the wild can begin to heal both. He argues, akin to ecofeminists before him, that the humans need to be nature participants and not dominators. Ultimately, this is a call to reclaim our wild, sacred connection with nature, not as a resource, but as a living, psychic, and spiritual partner. Another powerful example of this, in a little bit of a different way, is Miracles of Our Own Making, A History of Paganism by Liz Williams. Williams presents paganism as a living tradition where nature is sacred, alive, and central to human meaning making, a stark alternative to what we might see as disenchanted modernity. In tracing the trajectory of paganism from ancient nature-based polytheism to modern revivals such as Wicca, she demonstrates how pagans see nature as sacred, as alive and divine, ultimately animistic, cyclical with the seasonal rituals, and ethically entwined with human survival. Also as an entwinement of magic and ecology, where herbalism and land reverence frame magic as a cooperative dialogue with nature. Again, not domination. Just turning off my electric blanket. Also as a dynamic sacred web of life, not a resource then, but a teacher, an ally, a site of spiritual resistance. Ecofeminists have also talked extensively for several years about the interrelationship between patriarchy and the degradation of nature, as well as more recently via racism, classism, and misogyny. And this encourage our reconnection with and a cultivation of a deep respect for the natural world. In the classic Women and Nature, the Roaring Inside Her, Susan Griffin examines the connection between women and the earth as both a source of life for humanity and as an object of male violence. Beginning with Plato's conceptual split between spirit and matter, she reveals how patriarchal Western thought and religion deployed language and science to reinforce this domination over women and nature. Ecofeminist scholars have long asserted that women's relationship to nature constitutes a sacred reciprocity, rooted in embodied and spiritual interdependence. Pioneers like Vandana Shiva in Staying Alive draws a parallel between the exploitation of nature and the oppression of women in developing nations, arguing that both are systematically devalued. She highlights how science, technology, political systems, and economic structures perpetuate this cycle of exploitation, disproportionately harming both women and the environment. According to Vandana Shiva, the only viable solution for the survival and emancipation of people and the planet lies in embracing an ecological approach, one rooted in balance, long-term resilience, and respect for diversity. However, there's a stark contradiction, because whilst environmental harm disproportionately impacts women and Indigenous peoples, corporate sustainability governance remains dominated by powerful, invariably male-led organisations, which is a systematic barrier to just climate solutions. And here's my tenuous link. In a world where the climate crisis, global relations, global politics, technology, and the fast-paced pressures of work and daily life threaten to overwhelm, in a world where the mental health of many is seen as being in crisis, how can we respond? Of course, there are a myriad possible responses to this, and responding to this issue in one way does not preclude others. But one possible aspect and one possible response might be in ways that slow us down, which is a nice and cheeky little link to my colleague Elliot Cohen's work on kind of slow living, and he'll be talking later this week. But also to connect us with others and nature. And this, for me, brings us to circles. What are circles? What do I mean by circles? Well, at their simplest, they're usually supportive spaces where people can work through or share challenges, connect with others, collaborate, learn, and provide community or solidarity. There are lots of different types of circles, and many of these are quite different, from social justice or activism oriented to sources of mental support, to educational or mentorship, to community or collaboration building. Circles have been used in many different contexts to many different ends. It's possible that most circle origins are Indigenous ancient practices. And in this sense, it seems apt to return to some of the words from Black Elk, who was a medicine man of the Oglala Lakota people, from a book that was dictated to John Neihardt in 1932, called Black Elk Speaks. And he said this about circles: Everything the power of the world does is done in a circle. The sky is round, and I have heard that the earth is round, like a ball, and so are all the stars. The wind in its greatest power whirls. Birds make their nest in circles, for theirs is the same religion as ours. The sun comes forth and goes down again, in a circle. The moon does the same, and both are round. Even the seasons form a great circle in their changing, and always come back again to where they were. The life of a man is a circle from childhood to childhood, and so it is in everything where the power moves. Black Elk here was talking about how important the circle structure was to the Oglala Lagota lives, in contrast in particular to the square structures that the whites imposed upon them during colonialism, which affected their perceived power. But the circle is this kind of structure that can foster particularly equitable relations between people, and communications is quite well established. Healing, peacemaking, and talking circles, which are called hokoka in Lakota language, also mean altar and indicate sacred space. As researchers who transposed a healing circle into a primary care setting based on kind of indigenous wisdom suggest, the hokoka consists of people who sit together in a talking circle, in prayer, in ceremony, and are committed to helping one another and to each other's healings. This slide illustrates some of the potential applications that circles have had in various different contexts. I'm not going to go through them all, but it's really to show the sort of breadth of circle applications, from political liberation and resistance, to sisterhood and solidarity spaces, to restorative justice and peacemaking, to health and well-being within kind of holistic settings, but also within primary care settings, in Indigenous spaces, ones of respect and kind of inclusion and participation, and also for research methods and approaches to research. The women's circles I'm focused on have a particular history and a particular trajectory, so I'm considering those in a separate sense to some of the other circles, even though there are some links in the way in which they unfold. There are also men's groups and men's circles, some of which emerged around the similar kind of time to some of the women's circles, and have proved very beneficial for men in terms of combating patriarchal and misogynistic societal structures, but also just in terms of releasing and expressing emotions. So women's circles are regular gatherings of women, sometimes linked to the lunar calendar, which often has a symbolic relationship between the moon and menstruation. They might be open circles where participation is quite flexible, or closed circles where the group establishes members and then only really invites or replaces members if people leave. The numbers might vary in any circle depending on the space. I've known groups up to about 30 people and as small as kind of 4 or 5. The structure might be facilitated by a particular individual, maybe a holistic practitioner, such as a yoga teacher or a coach, but often at their heart, they're aiming to be non-hierarchical in structure. And the kinds of activities that occur within these spaces might include rituals, storytelling, sharing experiences, singing, dancing, arts and crafts, other sorts of spiritual practices, and meditation, which you'll hear a little bit more about when I come to describe my own experiences. Excuse me. Just need some tea to sustain me. In terms of the kind of historical roots and spiritual roots, really, of women's circles, they were very much influenced by the women's spirituality movement during second wave feminism in the 70s and into the 80s. And also this kind of movement included ecofeminism, the goddess movement, what then becomes kind of neo-paganism. And many women's circles and men's groups were established then not many of the same ones are still going in exactly the same form, but some of those central elements are potentially still there. Additionally, there was another interesting influence in 1997 with a novel that was published by Anita Diamant called The Red Tent, which retells the story of the rape of Dinah from the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. And it gives the women a great deal of agency and strong kind of voices in a way that the book in the Hebrew Bible does not. And the Red Tent there is a place where the women go to birth, to menstruate, to share wisdom with each other. And it's an empowering and kind of liberating space for these women. It's also spiritual, as well as kind of community building between them and this kind of sisterhood. Elisa Starkweather also established the Red Tent Temple movement in 2007, which is when a lot of groups or red tent circles kind of emerged. And she trained as a kind of priestess and became interested in women's empowerment, and brought this idea really from the States over to the UK, and it became kind of further afield and mushroomed. There's also a nominal kind of influence from ancient circle practices, as I intimated, and therefore kind of indigenous traditions, particularly Native American kind of moon lodges, though these are often a little bit divorced from their original cultural context, and care needs to be taken around the co-option or appropriation of indigenous practices, and the simplistic kind of romanticization of indigenous spiritualities or ways of being, particularly when this happens without any recognition of the violence and harms that were perpetuated by white colonizers on these communities, which all but kind of wiped out in violent ways their traditional practices. There are other practices as well, things like tarot, meditation, other kinds of divination, which reflect the kind of holistic milieu, where there's often that blend of the sacred and secular, which comes together in quite complex ways. Often this might be seen as, some scholars call it the wellness industry, where spirituality and well-being coalesce under capitalism. But I'll return to that again in my critical reflections. So research in this area has shown that red tents and women's circles are often supportive spaces for women to talk about often quite painful, traumatic experiences, but also just regular life experiences, including day-to-day kind of challenges and highs. But some of those they rarely discuss elsewhere, which became quite an interesting kind of point for Leidenfrost's research into red tents. There are also spaces that normalize menstruation in particular, but also other processes associated with normative female embodiment, sometimes called cisgendered embodiment. And in a sense, these spaces have been certainly positioned by some scholars as kind of reclaiming female bodies in that normative kind of way. Menstruation, menopause, in ways that were historically seen as quite shameful for women, and therefore as spaces of menstrual positive activism. Additionally, and perhaps somewhat conflictingly in some ways, or seemingly, there's also evidence of what both Chia Longman and I have called kind of emerging new or creative forms of femininity, which are kind of separate from exclusive female embodiment and seem more open to a kind of creative, symbolic feminine embodiment, which might be about an energetic feminine womb space, for instance, and not exclusively a female, normative female body, which provides an interesting kind of departure for discussion, and isn't the same in every single circle that you come across. Other aspects include this idea of a sort of spiritual sisterhood and a connection between women that, unlike the kind of sisterhood from the second wave, is not overtly political. I've also argued in work that I've done that red tents, because that was the research I was doing at the time, can be kind of refuges of resistance. So spaces where women can retreat from the pressures of kind of everyday life and neoliberalism, really, where a focus on women's experiences and shared vulnerability in non-judgmental spaces can form a kind of opposition to patriarchal structures. The stuff that's going on outside in the world, it just allows women to escape from that and think about their lives differently in a different space. So that's the kind of context and some of the research that's been conducted so far, thinking about women's circles, red tents, the kinds of spaces and what they might offer the women that participate in them. I currently participate in a women's nature circle, which I've been kind of part of now for, like I said, just nearly 7 years. And I want to just read a few details about it, and then also a sort of reflective piece more generally about my transition from kind of the world into the woods, if you like. So just a description first. We're a closed group, which means that with a small degree of variation, there are the core members, which at least 5 of us have remained the same over this period. And there's a general stability from month to month regarding who attends. We're all white women of differing class backgrounds, a mix of working and middle class. All of us are or used to be in heterosexual marriages or relationships. Ages range from 40s to 60s. Women tend to sign up for a block of monthly circles and then pay a small fee which covers drinks, homemade cake, the use of the space, and the facilitator's time. And the facilitator is a qualified feminine embodiment coach and I think NLP life coach, and also hosts other events in the woods, including other closed women's circles at different times, but also seasonal rituals. So I've sometimes taken part in equinoxes and solstices, and she also hosts children's nature parties in the woods as well. So this is my description, a kind of participant observation reflection. I drive to the woods as usual. I feel disconnected from whatever will unfold there as I'm listening to the radio, which speaks of worldly matters and current affairs in ways that are secular, stark and plain. Even if there are moments that cajole a smile or a smirk, the thoughts that accompany this route are fast and rushed and tumbling. They flit from one thing to another abruptly in a halting and evanescent manner. At the time, I don't experience an awareness of this. It's just how it is. My body is enjoying the experience of driving. At times, I'm an extension of the car, firmly rooted to the road and embodying the pace of rubber meets tarmac, spinning and purring and revving. Body blends into transporter as I am metal. I am the steering wheel. I'm the hulk of heaviness that feels light under my direction with an illusion of complete control. I observe that I am, at least, somewhat in my body. The turn off the main road signals a further shift. I begin to feel a thread pulling me towards the familiar wooded area. There are fields and mud and barren trees surrounding me as a snaking vehicle as I maneuver the length of the twists and bends before an arrow straight section of road invites me to turn into a smaller side road, which further beckons me via a mud track through a gate, and I'm simultaneously filled with butterflies and warmth. Taking out the warm, soft blanket I brought to wrap around my body and knees, I retrieve further outer layers that help dispel the cold. Woolly hat, scarf, warm gloves and snow boots. Not because there's snow, but just because it is always colder in the woods. Putting these on, I head towards the low-level chatter between group members and the facilitator who's offering hot drinks. There are hugs and small talk between us. Interestingly, this quickly becomes deeper talk about where we're at, meaningful events taking place in each other's lives, challenges and poignant moments as the group bond often enables a much swifter, deeper connection. There's no need to spend long on pleasantries. We all know why we're here. In time, members drift towards the campfire around which chairs are placed with more blankets. Next to one chair, there's a basket of wood and a small table with a clock, a large 5-minute egg timer hourglass, and a talking stick atop. Group members nestle into their chosen place, which differs each time, and on this occasion there are 8 of us as well as the group facilitator. There is a little chatter, laughter, and jokey remarks as everyone gets settled in a seat around the fire. The facilitator starts with a grounding exercise. We are invited to turn our attention inwards, to loosely gaze at the fire or close our eyes. We are encouraged to feel our feet on the ground, to pay attention to our breathing, and to register what is unfolding via our other senses. After our opening ritual, which facilitates a shift in consciousness and an orientation to the circle space, our senses, our bodies, and the wooded environment we are in, the facilitator offers a reflection, theme, focal point, or question for us to consider. At times, we take this to the woods individually for a short time. At others, we immediately reflect in circle. When the latter happens, we pass around a stick wrapped with different coloured wool threads, which acts as a talking stick. This is an object that permits the bearer to speak exclusively, to have the floor, as it were, until the sand has run from the 5-minute timer, or just afterwards. This is not strictly maintained, but just a guide to allow all the chance to speak. Circle members share whatever comes up in relation to the theme or often seasonal reflection. People share challenging life experiences, which might include matters connected to people's significant relationships, partners, care responsibilities, family, friends, work, historic traumas or abuse, loss, illness, chronic pain, but also joys, celebrations, challenges met or overcome, personal successes and highs. Some of our reflections pertain to the emotional, the psychological, the psychical or spiritual, to our sense of ourselves, our bodies, our roles, our minds, our identities, our lives in the social world, our relationships to the natural world, to political landscapes on a local and a global level. The books we read, love, and are inspired by, the practices that nurture us, our families and communities, and the way in which we impact the lives of others and change our worlds, even if on a small scale. We consider together who we are and what we want in our lives, some of us in ways that we have not permitted ourselves or felt allowed to do so before now. We reflect on our similarities and differences. We are quite different in our lives and worlds and views and beliefs, but there is a loving care that we share in circle which binds us like invisible thread. We listen to each other's stories, hold each other's good and bad times. We encourage vulnerability and see it as strength. This next reflection is a specific extract from one January winter session in the woods, and this is taken from my moments alone in the woods before I then return to the circle. I'm sitting on a fallen tree. It feels cold and hard underneath my sitting bones. I feel connected to its materiality via my bones. There is a brittle and inflexible connection between my body and the surface of the trunk. I wonder why I don't feel any contrast of soft flesh with hard wood, and realise, as always, that this reflects a state of mind, a rigidity in my inhabitation of myself, bristling at some trace of something in the doing world that I'm struggling to leave behind. At this point, I choose to close my eyes and go deeper into this feeling. I breathe deeply, consciously taking my breath down into my abdomen, slowing it down and sensing the shifts throughout my being. Waves of tingling calmness radiate in circles of light down and through my mind and body. I can feel the forest. I stay in this for several moments, just experiencing the difference as it unfolds and first permeates my mind before beginning to wear away the outer crust that encases me, blocking any connection between me and the tree, me and the woods. As this unfolds and untangles, I more immediately recognize my feet as firmly planted on the leaf-strewn forest floor. My terse externality begins to soften and meld with both the horizontal wooden seat beneath me and the winter woods around me. The bare trees seem to reflect back at me that it's okay to sometimes protect oneself from the surrounding harshness, that it is often necessary to go inside, draw reserves closer to the centre and move away from outside to inside, to zip up and respond to winter in this way. I find the words to what later becomes a poem emerge. Homage to the tree mirror. Cold seeps inside to every crack and crevice, like hard concrete, like smooth and unforgiving metal. I am overcome with harshness where I would want the soft. I am overwhelmed with tiny matters that swarm me like scratchy creatures, never letting up. I feel down. I sense the weight of this cold. I sense the dread of its bite. My extremities suffer, my fringes are frayed like old cloth, tired and worn. And yet the trees still look on. They are just there, swaying and standing, rooted and refined. No judgment emanates, just presence. How are they so solidly there? Not indifference, not joy-filled even, but some kind of murky reflection, offering me ways in which to see myself that reveal something new, waiting and just patiently just existing. No loaded agenda, no pointed perspective. And slowly but surely, this revelation evolves and grows in my mind, as if there's deep empathy between us, as if we're telepathically connected. And this is how it seems to work. The looking glass that emerges from the knotty bark, the shiny mirror of the ash, the oak, the birch, and the larch. When I look in and when I look out, I see me, as if all it takes is to switch one's own lens, one's own view, and witness the self that stares back from the glassy pool of tree. For me, regular attendance at this Nature Women's Circle allows me to more deeply connect with nature and the seasons, to see myself as being part of and embedded in nature, to feel a greater love for the natural world and our responsibilities to it. It helps calm, ground, and nurture me to appreciate its beauty and its starkness, death and rebirth. It helps me contemplate and deal with challenges in me, things in life, difficult emotions or stumbling blocks, things that are taking place in my everyday life, to reflect on my real world actions and behavior. Bucci studied people's experiences of living in nature and found that nature was deemed to be non-judgmental and provide space for feelings to surface, be acknowledged and integrated, creating the possibility for healing and spiritual growth. Nature was perceived as healer and teacher, providing the opportunity to discover a sense of oneness and connection with nature and the self. In a way that this certainly captures part of my experience. Bucci also says, when we are in nature, we are exposed to the truths of the universe. They show us the impermanence of constant change. Nature teaches us all those things for free when we pay attention. It doesn't distinguish between race, culture, gender, or belief. I'll return to this too. In many ways, I experience nature as sacred, as interwoven with human life. It helps cultivate a reverence for nature as a teacher and an ally, following paganism, and ecofeminism as an assertion of our relationship with nature, a sacred reciprocity. As Abram suggested, human encounters become potentially active and relational processes, not passive or dominant, but instead that embodied dialogue. And that's something I could feel myself and do feel myself experiencing when I'm in nature and in the circle. Humans then become nature participants and not dominators. As Swan suggested, These ways of relating to nature in meaningful and thoughtful ways are ultimately a kind of emotional bonding. Can they help cultivate an ecological mind? As I mentioned this, there is an emerging literature that immersion in nature appears to bring forward these positive attitudes and behaviours towards the natural environment and the natural world. And this is brought for me into even sharper relief by the presence of the group. The solidity of the connection with others and the strong sense of being safe, held and heard in this space is healing, transforming. The retreat from neoliberalism should not be underestimated. Indeed, from my research, the act of being in circle, being heard, being held, facilitates those healing, self-accepting community bonds amongst women, processing difficult experiences, sharing supposedly unacceptable emotions. And these kind of rituals of storytelling, openings and closing, help facilitate those shifts and cultivate a kind of sanctuary of what I've called agapeic love, one of kind of deep, non-romantic care and positive regard for other people. There are challenges and tensions, however. There are tensions with neoliberalism and post-feminism. So red tents and women's circles blend self-care and collective support, which challenge those ideas about neoliberal individualism by fostering community, but they also risk reinforcing the neoliberal self-improvement narratives with a focus on a never-ending need to improve oneself, whether it be physically, emotionally, spiritually, constantly doing work. And this central kind of tenet of neoliberal capitalist societies is reflected in the wellness space. And that balance, sometimes seen as very capitalism friendly, how do circles then balance the idea of self-care with the needs of others more broadly? These kind of circles have been criticised for depoliticizing feminism, which is related to this. So the kinds of spaces that might empower individuals, they might transform individual lives, improve individual mental health and subjective well-being, rarely address more structural inequalities such as racism or classism. So how can circles be a force for social good or social change if the focus is only on personal development and change? Of course, one counter to this is that women need to focus on looking after themselves in environments where they're burnt out from caring for others outside of those spaces, but also working and living. And the idea that kind of liberal feminism has failed women is a recurring theme in the research. Another issue is one of diversity and exclusion. So many women's circles are predominantly white spaces, cisgender spaces, middle-class spaces, which is reflected more broadly in the holistic realm, which maybe raises concerns about biological essentialism, simply tying womanhood to menstruation and normative female bodies, excludes more diverse expressions of womanhood, but also cultural appropriation and borrowing from indigenous traditions, and how sometimes that can be kind of carelessly done. Also, the other issue is that in these kinds of spaces, we find that often actually they're not spaces that have historically been inclusive. So nature environments, there's research now, but also there's comments suggesting Black people are less likely to work, live or visit rural environments. And when they have done or do, they face hostility, microaggressions, rudeness. So these are questions really for how we think about these things. Bucci insists that nature doesn't distinguish between race, culture and gender, but experiences of nature might be stratified by class and race in particular. I've written about elsewhere how whiteness comes to dominate spaces and how this can construct forms of exclusion. Layla Syed has written about white women's spirituality and how that needs to be deconstructed. does this imply that women's circles are exclusionary? What do we do about this? These are kind of questions. They're not statements. They're places to explore difficult issues. So my concluding thoughts are really just that. They are thoughts, and I'm beginning to kind of think about questions and tensions, because this is a new area of exploration for me in nature women's circles. And I think I've convincingly talked about some of the real benefits of these spaces and how significant they could be and can be in some ways. But what this might mean and how this might unfold in research, but also for other people, my thoughts go towards the idea of resistance to Western malaise, that these kinds of circles in some way begin to address aspects of the difficulties of the pace of life, disintegration of community, neoliberal capitalism, overwork, mental health crisis, disenchantment, disconnection from nature, etc., etc., etc. But also that still that means that there are some tensions and that there are some things to explore. And here are some potential ideas for what the role of nature might be in these kinds of gatherings, what nature offers women and others in those spaces, what the therapeutic effects of these circles are on people. The circles actually as a context themselves for exploring tensions. Are circles a place we could explore, and think about deep listening to difficult experiences of racism, for instance, or transphobia, or whatever it might be. But also circles as spaces that begin as places of self-care, but then also look to cultivate what we might think of as social good outside of those spaces. And again, there are conversations to be had on what on earth I mean by the social good, which I can't clearly even begin to start talking about now. And the one that seems to strike me the most is this idea of kind of personal healing to social activism, or nature immersion to ecological conscience. And I'm left with really that question: what is the potential for resistance from these circles? And I think I'll leave it there. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very, very much. I really, really enjoyed that. I was just wondering if there were any questions. I was just writing a question in the chat myself, actually. So I was just wanted to open it up and see if there's any other questions any students would like to ask. I'm going to actually type my question into the chat so Pete can so that Philip can look at it.
All right. First of all, thank you so much. This was a so far amazing experience to be taken into the woods. I feel I'm becoming a bit a part of nature myself. And Lee already posted a wonderful question asking, how do you see that men and women experience nature the same, differently? What would you feel about this?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that I've certainly been in situations where men and women have shared equally kind of deep and resonant reflections about being in nature. Maybe there are differences that are gendered, but I would hesitate to offer any simplistic kind of distinctions myself. I mean, I've read beautiful nature poetry that both men and women and non-binary and trans people have written, about their experiences in nature. So I don't think nature has to be gendered in that kind of way. I wonder if sometimes in that kind of quite stereotypical way, women are associated with nature, for good or bad in some respects. They were often dismissed. Women and nature were, kind of certainly historically associated, and that wasn't necessarily always favourable. But I think that there's no reason why certainly certain circles, for instance, couldn't be a mixed population of people. I don't think they have to be women only, for instance. And I've been in circle environments whereby there've been mixed kind of genders there, and I found that really helpful and useful in a very different kind of way, as long as everyone feels safe, because I think that's the consideration often for women. And when I say safe, I don't mean there's any threat or danger. I just mean that sometimes in those spaces, unless they're well managed, men can take over, or experiences can be dismissed, and again, I'm overgeneralizing to a certain extent, but that doesn't have to happen if you've got someone who holds the space very well. So yeah, I mean, I think that nature can affect anyone really deeply if they are allowed and given the kind of, maybe some of the tools with which to explore that, personally.
All right, that I thought that Lee was thinking about that women see the world as women and as human, of course, and men see the world as man and human. So I guess it was about this interlinking or this layer on top. If a woman as a woman human might see or feel, experience nature maybe differently as men see the world as men. I think this was my interpretation, but Lee can maybe say completely wrong.
Sure.
Not at all. Madeleine, thank you. Every time I've heard you speak, there's something about what you're sharing, and particularly about this idea of community and being encircled, that I have to say really deeply moves me. And part of the reason for asking the question, and I'm not even sure what the question is that I'm asking, so to speak, so forgive me for bumbling through this a little bit.
Please do.
My experiences in activism with Extinction Rebellion, the power of circle, the power of coming together in community. When I think back to the national rebellions that I've been over the last how many years, I forget now, but it was at least 3 or 4 national rebellions that I went to. Predominantly, it felt like it was this really nurturing, compassionate, feminine movement. And I think that was really important. And, when I look around at the world today, at what perhaps some young men are really longing for, well, I'm not even sure they know they're longing for it, but perhaps require this sort of masculinity that's balanced and is in contact with that feminine aspect within ourselves. And I look at what I almost get a sense that somehow what we need to, what's going to happen, and what the world requires at this moment feels like it needs to have be facilitated or catalyzed through femininity, through a women's movement. Sort of, you know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, I do, and I think there's sometimes I think these things are quite difficult to talk about, because anything that's said becomes binarized very quickly, as if, if you say femininity, all you mean is this kind of cultural stereotype about women, for instance, or, like I was saying, normative female bodies. But actually, I think this is why I think that kind of creative idea of femininity and symbolic femininity, the kind of Jungian, I mean, there are sometimes aspects and problems with Jung when it comes down to, his depiction of women, but I love the work of Jung in some ways. And I think the idea that the anima and animus ideas, the essence of kind of holding masculine and feminine energy, if you like, in all of us, that could manifest in different ways, and that we maybe need a rebalancing of society that really engages with the feminine. I couldn't agree more, quite frankly. And I think what's difficult maybe is how that could manifest in a way that would be healthy, that would be kind of organic, because I think it would need to be, you can't force things like that. And personally, I get the sense that there are shifts in some places, but then there's a backlash in others. And so it's kind of, certainly in the work that I'm doing, I feel like I'm navigating that space whilst trying to not force something before maybe it's time. I don't know if that sounds a little bit, I don't know if what that sounds like, but in a way I'm very aware that femininity and what that means in terms of how you relate to the world, how you relate to other people, is lacking in many ways, and absolutely should be celebrated and brought to the fore in lots of ways, but that we live in times that are polarized around even what that word means.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's thank you, because it is so incredibly difficult to navigate the language of this. And you're absolutely right. You know, this archetypal element of femininity and masculinity that's been this healthy balance seems to be what's so needed in the world. And it's becoming really real, isn't it, when we look at the context of what's happening in America at the moment, and how other things are happening in Europe and within the UK itself, that actually there is something about it's asking almost, we're at a point where almost there's no hiding from this, and it is going to require the resistance that you're describing in these environments that I think is so important. It's how we sort of bring that resistance together in a way, and I think there's so much for men to learn from these experiences, and that's what moves me every time I hear you speak.
Thanks, Lee. Thank you. I think the other thing I just wanted to say was, and I haven't connected what I've been talking about in this particular talk, but there's a huge movement within the social sciences, sociology, and some of politics to start talking about what we mean by the social good and what it means to care for other humans and nurture that sense of community. And all of that is totally connected to what's going on within women's circles, even if not, you know, oh, we're leading a revolution or anything so grandiose. There's nobody's claiming that, but just those ideas of kind of like, if we can't control things on a grand scale, what can we do amongst and around ourselves as far as we can in order to, you know, kind of have that almost like evolving sense of care, acceptance, nurturing, love. Like, I'm not scared of talking about love in academic contexts anymore. You know, which, like, for a long time people would not mention that, and it's interesting to see that's appeared in quite secular contexts, and I for one am certainly glad of that. So yeah, I absolutely, thank you. I really welcome your contribution, Lee.
Thank you. Beautiful.
So if we move forward, we all can profit from a feminine eye, men and women looking at nature through our feminine qualities. Is that one pointer? Now we have a great question from Romy, but I would like, because I think it's quite fitting, I would love to hear your opinion about liberal feminism in this context, basically sitting in the wooded circle and feeling all of this connectiveness, and then looking in some media splashes that we get from this liberal feminism. How do you feel about this?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, I would say that my feminism is complex. I don't think I know a single feminist who would say that their feminism is simple. For me, feminism is an ongoing critical conversation with the structural inequalities around me and the marginalization of particular people, whether that be women, whether that be small communities, other identities, different social locations, race, class, etc., as well as gender and sexuality. But I think the idea, when I mentioned about liberal feminism, this kind of the idea that you know, women can and supposedly have been were freed in the 60s and 70s, and therefore able to work and have children and do this and do that and do everything else. And it, instead of it actually being liberating, which I think lots of women thought it would be, it kind of just meant that women took on this double, triple load. Because research bears out that women take on the bulk of the domestic chores. They're the ones doing the emotional labor in the house. They're the ones predominantly looking after the kids or caring for relatives or whatever it might be. And so I think certainly within the holistic sphere, there have been lots of women who've just gone, okay, thanks feminism on the one hand, but at the same time, that kind of feminism didn't work for us. It didn't, and it certainly didn't incorporate a spiritual element at all. It was very secular and very rationalist, and in a way perpetuated the male academy, for a large majority of women working in those and thinking and operating in those spaces. And I feel like sometimes I have one foot in those spaces and one foot in a kind of intersectional feminism. So for me, there's a kind of complex relationship, but I know that women within those kinds of spheres have rejected what they saw as kind of the liberal model of feminism because it didn't offer them what they wanted, and it didn't take their spiritual experiences seriously, and it didn't take their, connection with the natural world or the sense of the sacred, and how they practiced in a way that wasn't patriarchal forms of Christianity seriously. So yeah, as per usual, and I would say this, I think it's really, really complex. I don't think there's a simple answer as to how those two things are united in ways. I think we need to be better at listening.
Well, if I quite a quick personal statement and political, which basically I hope there's a second for it. I was a bit thought an opportunity missed. I was very saddened to see Kamala Harris' campaign, because I think she could have done a much more amazing job in this day and age to be showing us what a woman president could look like, what a connected female feminist woman as woman could have done, and themes like nature and ecology and so forth. They were all written, some were the bullet points, but listening how you are connected and listening how you want to make impact directly hands-on in your community, I think it was a poor showing of a great woman leading forward, how that, if I'm allowed to put this point here.
I think it's really difficult sometimes to navigate those sorts of spaces whereby, certainly traditionally, and I even can look back on my own early academic experiences and think I need to emulate a certain quite masculine way of being and rational way of being. And, there's nothing wrong with the rational. I use it all the time, but it isn't my only mode of being. And I have no fear of using the irrational. I mean, I don't call it that, but you know what I mean? The sort of sense that one comes without the other for me is a nonsense. It doesn't make any sense at all. And the very possibility of drawing on those kind of more sensuous experiences that we all have access to, like, sure, it is seen as representative of the feminine, but it's a fundamental part of humanity and should be a fundamental part of humanity in that kind of way. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, Ronnie, I'm not such a quick reader. Can you ask the question yourself, please?
I just actually, on the point that you were just making, I've just said that even women's clothes in the 1980s emulated men's shape with the huge shoulder pads. So everything was focused on, I mean, even like in the workspace, I've been in the workspace, and the women that get ahead are women that they dress in a certain way, they act in a certain way. In my experience, within social work, within education, within business and corporate,
And it's actually been, they dress in a certain way, they act in a certain way, they're very firm in a certain way. And there doesn't seem to be much gentleness, softness, or approachability. And I know that is changing, but that's been my experience over the last sort of 20 years, like 20 years ago and then coming up. So, but my actual question was, it's backing onto something you said about the use of these circles for the larger to have the larger conversations about politics and about racism and various other things. And my question was, is there a risk to mental health of using circles to address the bigger issues? It sounds as if it has been a space for allowing for the presence of our small selves rather than ourselves in the larger context. So really? They become more nurturing spaces for us to, for us to be. When I say small, I don't mean, I mean ourselves in that true, I'm moaning about something that's happening in my home and in my life, sure, rather than someone turning around and saying, well, look what's going on in Ukraine, look what's going on in Russia, look what's going on, how can you moan about that? And that's actually, again, that's almost that gaslighting, that dismissing of ourselves. And one of the things he said earlier was about I see it as the ripples, and that actually when people are in community and they're they're bonding and they're learning about each other and they're expressing themselves, they're actually already changing the world. They're already addressing those issues. They may not be speaking those issues out, but they're already having a differing of a perspective. Their prism is already changing. So they're then going back out into the communities. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think thank you, Romy. They're really interesting questions, because those are the things that I may be grappling with still, and it's an ongoing kind of grappling. And I think, there are several things. I think first of all, the idea of sort of being able to explore or hear experiences of racism or experiences of transphobia within a circle space shouldn't not be able to happen. So double negative, hate double negatives. But what I mean is, if someone in that space brings their own personal experiences of racism, microaggressions, whatever it might be. I mean, we all bring, our own experiences potentially of sexism or, sexual harassment, or, in the worst case scenarios, race or rape or abuse or whatever it might be. So I suppose when I talk about those big issues, I mean the personal experiences of those big issues. And I think the circle is a very good space at dealing with those tricky issues, mainly because it allows that space. And we've had some differences in our circles whereby people have said things and, that's brought up stuff maybe for me, maybe for somebody else. And we have to negotiate that and think about how to respond. And our first response is always one of care and love, even if that's difficult. There's never been a big bust up or a Barney or any of that kind of stuff. And that's definitely to do with that holding and respect for the kind of circle space. So I think that's the first thing I would say is, and equally, interestingly, because sometimes we can't help but be affected by encountering the news or, kind of politics locally. I'm thinking of, the recent election results, and in this country, local election results, and how much that's had an impact on people. We haven't had a circle yet in the woods, but I imagine that will come up because it will impact and does impact on the reality of people's existence, because it affects all sorts of things. So, and even world stage stuff, it does actually come up. People say, oh, you know, the way in which, and Ukraine might have impacted people because they might have actually taken refugees, or taken people into their homes and all of that sort of stuff. So weirdly, that big world stuff comes into conversations more than you might think, even though you sort of imagine it's small world stuff. So that's the first thing, I think. And the second thing is like, I think there absolutely is a real ripple effect. Like, I genuinely think that in providing those environments whereby you have an opportunity, Audre Lorde talks about self-care, you can't look after other people or fight for other people, let's say, from a social activist perspective, if you haven't taken care of yourself. So it's like you do need to take care of yourself. And so there is absolutely a legitimate part of being in a circle that means that some of that is care and nurturing and kind of small change, as it were, in order to potentially precipitate bigger change. But I think what I'm interested in is, well, I bet there are, and I don't know about them yet because I'm yet to do the research, bigger examples of kind of, you know, being in circle and having these experiences allowed me to therefore, you know, do X in the community, or, you know, whatever. I mean, I do know of like about 4 or 5 examples. So already of people kind of ultimately and resonating with each other about things, finding out about different projects that are taking place, and therefore, you know, signing up to take part in something. Those kinds of things massively seem to happen via a circle space. And that's from my own reflections and just things that I know, never mind doing, you know, conducting broader research on it, which I'd like to do. So I think the potential is there, but I don't think you should force it. Again, it's got to emerge organically. It has to. So.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for answering that question. Thank you.
We have now a question that sprung out of the same moment from Lee's and my mind, the exact same moment. Because, of course, we are kind of curious how you yourself see the circle. Is the beginning or the end, or is it supposed to then ripple effect into society? Exactly this transition is for you the circle that the holy place, and this is where you now focus and where this is happening, and then people might bring it individually, or you think there will be a natural growth and process where this sacredness will transform into the society?
Yeah, I mean, not being one for predicting the future, for me, the sacred space is so special. It's so special. It's so, like you said, Philip, it's sacred. It is completely a beautiful, nurturing space where I get so much out of personally, but I know that the community gets so much out of. If I'm talking about the circle that I'm part of, the idea that circles have potential, I almost have no investment in. And what I mean by that is, if people feel organically called to set up circles, or like, I'm not going to spearhead some circle collective movement. That is definitely not my calling specifically, although potentially in the future I can imagine kind of facilitating circles. But I do believe in the power of circles. So perhaps my evangelical pseudo preaching about them in some sense might have another unintentional ripple effect, which is that people become interested in circles and the potential of circles in a whole variety of different ways and explore them themselves. You know, what are circles? What do they mean? Might they play a role in my life? Who knows? And in what way and in what form? Or they might go and experience one and become similarly kind of evangelical about it. So yeah, I like to imagine or think about, because I'm an intellectual in some ways, that kind of possibility. Like, what's the possibility? What's the potential for them? But if it doesn't happen and it doesn't emerge, then it doesn't happen. It's kind of, I will do what I continue to do, and I am still interested in exploring what it means to evolve a notion of the common good, or whatever that is. Yeah. And so that will always drive me in some way, whether that's some kind of obvious social activism or whether it's something more ripple effect. And that I like that idea, the squares and triangles as well as the circles, sacred geometry. Yeah, but I think that's maybe not that's not mine to know, and that's okay. I don't need to. Sorry, that a bit of a cop out?
Not at all.
It's more than fine. Well, we have two options: the wonderful question of Romy about sacred circles, or my very boring question about ecofeminism and coming from all of this spirit, if you see it transforming in some businesses or some realities. So you may choose sacred geometry or ecofeminism becoming somehow the thought or the spirit of the circle, if it already like real world application in businesses and things like that, if it's something nurtured by it. I would be very keen to know if some examples exist. So you may choose. Let's see who's got the better question, Romy.
Yeah, no competition. Yeah.
There is, as always is.
Yeah, I can see that.
I was going to say, mine wasn't really a question.
Well
Mine was
done.
just a comment on the circle, then the square, and then the triangle over, and actually them each being possibly differing forms of governing. So we were talking about I think you were talking about the white settlers coming over and putting squares on the moon lodges, that type of, sort of structures. And then we have the hierarchy of the triangle. So so I was thinking those shapes are sort of interwoven through communities and cultures and societies. So I think Philip's question is the better one.
So, Philip, what was your question again? Because I can't even remember what you said now. I was looking through the chat
about
going,
ecofeminism, and if from the spirit of these circles, if there is some real world applications, some companies, some movements that you would think are connected to the spirit.
So, I mean, I would say that having done a very small amount of looking via ecofeminism, there are sometimes circles that meet connected to activists kind of projects or particular kind of trajectories, whether they are used by organizations. I mean, I know they're used in work contexts, and there was certainly at one point there were within corporations and organizational kind of structures, not exactly the same, but the kind of circle applications, like the slide that I showed you on circle applications, there were some in there. The eco sort of feminist angle tends to be more indigenous or kind of rooted in communities. So the stuff that I encountered was to do with, projects where they're reclaiming, replanting particular kinds of seeds, which have a significance to the local population or the indigenous kind of peoples who live on a particular area of land. So a lot of the global south stuff, naturally had circles anyway, and that becomes part of a wider collective project to reclaim kind of sacred relationships with the land. So in that sense, yes. Is that the kind of thing that you're asking about?
I would love to ask you, because you mentioned it a couple of times. Do you think that there's so much that your circle could learn from indigenous circles? Is that something that you're looking out to see those women's and is there interconnection happening?
So I'm not sure there is an interconnection, and I think that a lot of the time there's a disconnect between what are seen as, I'm just going to boldly say it, white women spiritual circles and, you know, kind of indigenous women spiritual but activist circles. So there's a sort of, because there's a drive and a purpose towards, maybe it's indigenous sovereignty, maybe it's kind of reclamation of power, maybe it's rewriting kind of traditions that have been stamped out by colonialism. There's a sort of more clear purpose for those sorts of circles and groupings, in a way that the purpose is less activism focused for white women spiritual circles. So it becomes one of addressing the context in which we find ourselves, let's say, Western neoliberal capitalist kind of framework, from which we've got mental health issues, you know, people struggling with their everyday lives, work, da-di-da. So maybe that's how these things differ in the way in which they express themselves, but there absolutely is something we could learn from indigenous kind of feminisms in that sort of way. I would say it's just the beginning of certainly sources, because if you don't have those sorts of connections, you definitely don't want to go and start exploiting. Oh, can you teach me something about it? You know, that's not the kind of way in which anyone would want this to work. But if people are writing about, or some indigenous feminists are writing about their own kind of experiences, and there are some of the references I've got on that other slide about, on the circle applications, about kind of liberatory pedagogies, which is, you know, ways of either indigenous or Black communities in the Western world kind of reclaiming aspects of spiritual practices, circling practices, collective sistership, if you like, in those sorts of ways. So I think white women have got to be careful about taking from in that way, but equally respectfully learning from, absolutely.
Thank you. Madeleine, thank you so much. I'm going to just put it out here. This is an ongoing conversation. Please keep doing your work. Will you come back and share more in the future? And I know Romy and I would really like to put together a Eunoia summit that is about the feminine, and is bringing all together so many different leaders. We'd love you to be part of that. Can I ask everybody to Oh, I didn't quite get an answer then. There was almost a nod.
Yes, sorry, I was waiting for a gap. To say yes. And also an opportunity to plug the British.
Yeah, please do that now.
Yeah,
please.
So the British Psychological Society, I'm on the committee for the transpersonal section, and we've got our conference in Scarborough this year coming up in September between the 19th and the 21st, called Sacred Unity: Transpersonal Dialogues with Nature, Earth and Self. And I'll be talking again there, as will some of my colleagues. So yeah, I hope you're more than welcome, and I hope to see you there. I'll maybe try and put a link in the chat as well.
Absolutely, and we will share that as well. So tomorrow is William Bloom, same time, same place. He's speaking about a project he's got going on in bringing spiritual well-being into education. It's just for us to unmute and to give a hearty clap to Madeleine for this fantastic work that she shared tonight. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So thank you everybody for your time and your attention tonight. If there's questions, please pass those to us and we'll share those with Madeleine. And we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. So thank you ever so much. Go away, let those percolate, and have another cup of coffee or another cup of tea or whatever your drink is, and enjoy your evening. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So thanks ever so much, folks. I'll let you all go. I will let you all go, and we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Oh wow! Today you didn't kick me out, Lee.
No, I didn't. I
didn't do so bad today like yesterday.
I'm going to just thank you, John. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I'm just going to pop you into the waiting room because I want to just have a second to catch up with the team as we go into tomorrow. So thanks ever so much, John. See you
Thank you.
tomorrow. Bless you. I think that's the four of us now. Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you. Oh my goodness! Every time you get me, every time. The chills are up and down my spine, and I can't find the words, but I know there's something you keep triggering in my heart every time I hear you speak. Bless you. I will
Thank you.
find the words to make sense of it, but I know it's about, yeah, it is about learning, and it's a learning from another part of me, and that is this archetypal feminine, and I know it is to learn from the feminine, the female elders in this world. There's something that keeps speaking to me about the changes that are going to take place is going to need both of us working together, but actually it's almost, there's got to be some sort of reversal of the place. I feel it's like the masculine supporting the feminine rather than the other way around, or any combination of. I don't know if I'm making sense at all, but it's just something that I keep feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you should say that, because there's definitely something kind of bubbling for me, but equally, whatever it is not ready to be wholly articulated yet. So I'm just following the trajectory until I get wherever I get to. You know, it seems to be.
I would just love to point out, when you had your most feministic moment, Lee and I was the one shaking you at the head like crazy, and Ronnie was sitting very calm and relaxed, like you're telling it me. Thank you so much. A wonderful evening. I will leave the chat and see you tomorrow, guys.